I invite you to take your Bibles, please, and turn to Leviticus. We're in the 19th and 20th chapters. We're lesson number 9. I think these chapters go together very, very well. We have, beginning in chapter 18, we have examined some particular sins that are set forth, and we find them again, especially in chapter 20. But that's not repetition. There's a reason for talking about them again. And I hope we can pick up on why that reason might be. He's just not being repetitious, and every time he talks about fortune tellers and wizards and those who practice divination, and you'll see it again. Chapter 19, you'll see it again in chapter 20. It's not just being redundant for redundancy's sake. The Holy Spirit didn't forget, Moses didn't forget what they've already dealt with, but there's something always distinctive about it that may be a little different, and then when you put that together, it's a powerful point, and I hope we can grasp that together this evening. We talked about it a little bit last week. Let's just kind of make sure in these first 4 verses, what's the basis of things that are condemned is the 10 Commandment law, and we ask you in those first 4 verses, please notice the first verse. Jehovah spake to Moses, and speak unto all the congregation of the children of Israel, and say to them, Ye shall be holy, for why? For I am holy. And that is, I'm Jehovah your God, but indeed your God, Jehovah, is holy. So therefore, in verse 3, what commandment do you see there that's the basis for what he says here? Every man shall fear his father and his mother. Which commandment is that? Honor your father and mother, and we know that means obey. In Ephesians 6, we know that means requite them. In Timothy, when they take care of themselves, and it goes with honoring. Jesus said, you didn't honor them because you said it's devoted to Corban. I dedicate all what I could give to my parents for them. So we have that basis that Jesus lived upon, but that's the one that we see there. What's the second commandment you see there from the Old Testament? 10 Commandment law. All right, you shall keep my Sabbaths, plural. But every Sabbath, and then the next Sabbath, and the next Sabbath, they would be plural. And you were to keep those. And how were they to keep them? They were not to do work. And that was a day of rest. And notice it says, I am Jehovah your God. I'm stating, he just said, your relationship to me is why you're doing what you're doing. And then, turn not unto idols. Which commandment is that? Thou shalt have no other what? God before me. And then the making of the images. You not make molten images, and here's the molten gods. And what does he say? I am Jehovah your God. He's not being redundant there either. He's emphasizing that the reason these are there is because I'm Jehovah, and therefore you will be holy as I am holy. He rested on the 7th day. His people are going to rest on the 7th day. And there's where he begins to speak about these commandments. And now we get into some particulars that are connected with Leviticus that I think are interesting. We've already talked about the offerings. And when I say peace offerings, what concept is that? It's fellowship. And the reason it's being fellowship, a concept, that we're offering it to God, but the priest would have a portion he would eat of. The person that is offering the peace offerings as a free will offering will have a portion to take home, and which they would partake of it. So we're partaking of the same sacrifice. We're partaking of the same sacrifice that was given upon the altar. We're sharing in it, priest and people and God. And what is that sharing? What concept? That's fellowship. And I think it's very interesting that when we get through Leviticus, and we've already established this, that you had the whole burnt offerings. There's that total dedication to God. Jesus fulfilled that. Jesus fulfilled every concept of the Old Testament sacrifices. Is it through him that we have fellowship with God? There would be your peace offerings. There's the sin offering. There's the trespass offering. He paid the price. And the whole burnt offerings. Whole burnt offerings I would not have, but we're studying on Hebrews now. We're switching now to Sunday. We're seeing that he came to do God's will. Why? He's a burnt offering. He's the whole burnt offering. And a body thou hast prepared for me. I'm going to do your will, O God. There's your burnt offerings. Burnt offerings I would not take from the animals. They can't take away sin, but this burnt offering did, Jesus Christ. And so these are things in the mind of God, and Jesus is indeed going to fulfill that. So our question here is, offering the peace offering properly resulted in what blessing in this text? And it's not new to us. It just may seem new because it's been a long time since we've been in chapter 1. It may be new to you again. But what do you see there as a blessing for offering the peace offerings? What? Accepted by God. Your person is accepted by God. And that's Leviticus 1:3. When the offerings were going to be said, you bring them to God so your person can be accepted to stand before him. It's going to take a sacrifice. I'm holy, you're not. And there would be a sacrifice that would be offered to be in the presence of God, that he would accept you as your person. And so we see that in the life of men who lived in the Old Testament days. They would bring a king a present. They would have an offering so they would receive the person. And this is the concept that we see in these sacrifices as well. As we pointed out before, you see application of the peace offerings. You see it in a situation that we see in the book of wisdom, where a young man comes too close to the lady's door, or she walks out and kisses him, and he's on his way to sexual ruin, and his character is ruined. He's an ox going to the slaughter. And she said, vows I've made. That was a peace offering, a vow. Come and partake of that with me. Now, if he's a Jewish boy, he said, we've got to do it tonight. And we're going to eat it in the morning, because on the third day, could you eat it? I wonder who commanded that. God did. It shall be eaten the same day you offer it. Verse 6. And on the morrow, if all remain until the third day, it shall be burnt with fire. And if it be eaten at all on the third day, it is an abomination. But don't worry about it. It's okay. You just made a mistake. It shall not be accepted. You will not be accepted before God. But everyone that eateth it shall bear his iniquity, because he has profaned the holy thing of Jehovah, and thy soul shall be cut off from his people. Your life will be cut off from your people. That was a death penalty. And we've noted, and I hope you keep picking up, when it says it is most holy, it is holy unto Jehovah, that is also going to be connecting that. The reason it was especially holy and separated to God, because his priest would partake of it. His workers, the tabernacle, be supported by these gifts. So it's a lot of times it's most holy. We don't think in terms of most holy that it'd be shared with anybody else. But his workers would be. It's totally dedicated to him. It's most holy. It's most set apart, because that's what the priests are going to be feeding upon. That's what they're going to have. So we see, you profane God. It was holy. And we think of holy was pure and all that. No, it was something that belonged to him and his workers. And your person will not be accepted. So you better be careful how you offer your free will offerings and peace offerings. And you better be careful when it's eaten, because if they ate it on the third day instead of burning that sacrifice, they would be cut off from their people. So there's the peace offerings of realize I'll be accepted as a person. It had its conditions, and it's just so interesting when you get a hold of these. There's so many things in the Bible that's going to come alive to you. And why that was such a point that lady was making, she was hitting him from the standpoint of, don't fear, the man's gone. You don't have to fear danger like that. And I've been looking for you. He hits his pride. She kisses him strongly, said, you're the one I've been looking for. So here he thinks he's the most important thing in the world to her. And besides that, I've offered peace offerings. I'm such a religious lady. I've offered peace offerings of vows, and we have to partake of it tonight. You know that, don't you? So why don't you come to my house? There's your perverted fellowship. You come to my house, and he would think, well, you got to do that. That's part of the law. And he's on his way to ruin, isn't he? See, that comes alive because you know something about peace offerings. You know the concept of why Jesus would maybe fulfill that aspect. He is our peace. He is our peace. So I want us to think about fellowship when we see peace offerings in the Bible. How did God take care of the poor and the sojourner in his laws? Now here, just rapid fire. Here's some things that just mention one thing right after another, and we're going to hit some of them. Some of them we won't, but we'll talk about them. So how did God take care of the poor and the one that's passing through, the sojourner? They would, it's how they would take their harvest, wouldn't they? Would they, in the corners of their fields, what would they leave? You shall not wholly reap the corners of that field. So they're leaving things behind, aren't they? Neither shalt thou gather, my Bible says, the gather of gleaning of thy harvest. Well, how can I have a harvest if I can't gather the gleaning? What do you think's happening? You left some behind, didn't you? Out there in the field. The corners of it, you were not to harvest at all. That was to be totally, you shall not wholly reap the corners. There'll be there that's left. But there'll be things in the field as left as well, and that you're supposed to leave behind. Thou shalt not glean the vineyard. Idea, there'll be left some. Go ahead, David. And I can't think about Ruth, but every time I do that, there's just something of dignity in that book from the very how people interact, but just from the idea of the dignity of work. Who had to glean that? She went out and get it. There was work to be done, but it was provided there. But it's something they would do to help their own cause, but it would be provided there. They didn't have a safety net and Social Security and all that sort of thing to have government help people. But this is how God's law worked, and I think it's pretty efficient. That indeed all those fields will be open, and as they would need food, they could get it. Maybe not like they would like to have, but there in a sense would be sharing with those who don't have anything. I remember this, and it was an embarrassing moment in Lithuania. I mean, ever since I was a kid, if I found a dime on the road, I'd pick it up. I'd pick up money if I found it on the road. I'm over there walking these big places leading up to religious buildings and so forth, especially Orthodox church buildings. I found all sorts of money on the ground, and I thought, wow, but that was for the poor. And they would leave them in the city. You walk the streets of Konus, and you would see a lot of that left behind. There would be money there. Well, it was a shameful thing for me to pick that up, and I had to learn that. I just saw people, why is that American doing that? Because that's how they provided. And yet there would be widow ladies, there would be people that are poor. They would pick up that money in order to get by for the day. So that same type of principle is even done with the Catholic Church, of or the Greek Orthodox Church in those places as well. But that was Russian Orthodox. That they had that. So I had to learn. As an embarrassing moment, so I didn't do that anymore. And I got my money somewhere else, but I didn't pick it off the ground. Yes? Yeah. How do you feel about people coming over the border in the southern border? Would you share your food with them? You know, it's demonized time, but we got to think ourselves in the sense of God's people. And a lot of times that may be opportunities that we have to teach, even though we don't agree with the government what things are doing. It's causing a lot of heartache and people not obeying the laws we have on the books. All that you can argue, and I agree. But the point is that here, a lot of people, that may give us opportunities to share with them what we have, and the ranchers have done plenty. I think the rest of us can do something about it. They've had their things taken away. And so there was all that abuse and so forth. But sometimes we need to realize God was very kind to the sojourner passing through. God was very kind to those who were foreigners. And he expected his people to be that way for them as well. But that's how he took care of the poor and those who are passing through. How does one profane, question number 4, how does one profane the name of God? Swearing falsely or swearing at all? Sinful to swear, isn't it? And this is where we get the concept, what did he mean by that? It means I'm going to make an oath. I can say the oath, but I don't have to necessarily fulfill it. That was the loophole of the Jews in Jesus' day. Paul, he swore an oath. Jesus swore an oath. It's not sinful to swear by God that you're telling the truth. But the point is, that's not the basis of what, that's just more confirmation. God did that, as we've studied in Hebrews. He just made it more emphasized it's going to happen because he swore with an oath, I'll be a priest after the order of Melchizedek. So it's not inherently evil to swear. We talk about James and Jesus, swear not at all. But it's always, don't just swear and think, well, I don't have to give that. If I've swore by this or swore by that, I have to. You know, your word, your bond. That's the point that he's making. But the point is that we see here, don't forswear yourself. That is the point as to be set forth. Now, verse 11, you shall not steal. All right, we got that. Neither shall you deal falsely with someone, or lie to one another, and you shall not swear by my name, period. No, you shall not swear by my name falsely. You use my name, you better fulfill it. I don't want the sacrifice of fools, Ecclesiastes says. And that's when you profane the name of a God. He says, I am Jehovah. He keeps emphasizing. And what are we picking up on here? Well, here's my relationship with God. We don't have time to go into it, but you read Jeremiah, the godly man swears by my name. That's what a Jew was to do. But he was to fulfill it. That's part of the Ten Commandment law. He was to fulfill those vows. So one profanes the name of God. We talk about what he says dirty words, and when he takes God's name in vain, just flippantly using his name. All that's true. That's principle. But it comes back here of just empty use of God's name when you're making a promise. And that's what they needed to guard against. Not that they could not swear by his name. Godly people were commanded to do that. In the Old Testament, and you may have, your conscience may be different in the New Testament, but if you look closer, you begin to realize that the examples of Paul and examples of Jesus and really what they were driving at when they condemned swearing was dealing with the loopholes that God's people had made, or that Israelites had made. And we've looked at that before. How does one bear sin because of his neighbor? And that was not to be done. And let me just hit these real quickly, leading up to those. He said, what do we see in verse 13, 14? We could sum up this with one word. Thou shalt not oppress thy neighbor, nor rob him. The wages of a hired servant shall not abide with thee all night until the morning, because it was daily wages. You paid everybody every day. That's the way it operated. So if you kept back his daily wage, give me this day my daily bread. That was part of the routine, and you weren't supposed to do that. Thou shalt not curse the deaf. Could they hear you? Oh, they could read lips, okay, but they couldn't hear you. You shall not curse the deaf, nor put a stumbling block before whom? The blind. They can't see, they can't hear. But thou shalt fear thy God. I am Jehovah. Relationship. Now, when you read verses 13 and 14, what's one word that you could put there that God's law will demand? I call it kindness. I call it consideration for deaf people, consideration for blind people. It's being, don't oppress your neighbor. It's being kind. The guy worked all day. How come you keeping his wages? Kindness. And that is being just, but there's a sense of the kindness being done to your neighbor, and you have a place of paying the wages. You don't keep them overnight. You be kind. You're being considerate. And that's what God's people ought to be as well, even today. One of the fruit of the Spirit is kindness. Kindness. And sometimes we're not kind. You find people after COVID and all the things that are happening in our economy and paying $5 a gallon and all that, you find a lot of people being kind? Or they just had it? Heard today he was a Catholic priest, and he was standing behind a fellow, and of course this Catholic priest was an exorcist. So that's another issue. But he's devoted his entire life of casting out demons, and he still does it, according to the Catholic Church. But he was standing in line of a lady, no, it was a man, and the lady was a cashier at a bank, that sort of thing, and she just says, "Have a good day." And he went into her, "I'll tell you if I have a good day or not. Who are you to tell me to have a good day? I will determine what kind of day I'm going to have. Thank you very much." And he just walked off. Well, she was dumbfounded, but the priest comes up there and he said, "You can tell me I have a good day. You don't know what I've been through." He's been through exorcism, so he wanted to have a good day because he's had a rough time. But just the sense, that was not kind. That was frustration people have. But we got to remain kind. That's what comes out of our hearts because we're following the things of the Spirit. So that leads us to this question. How does one bear the sin because of his neighbor? You want to be kind? Okay. But there's something that you better beware of and you better consider. What is that? How would you bear sin because of your neighbor? Gordon? That's right.
I think a good passage if we look in Galatians 6:1-5, we see the understanding of if a brother who is undertaking any trespass, we are spiritual, restore such one, and not only bearing your own burdens, but also those of your brothers who you love. And then also, the chapter before that, we're commanded all the words filled with one word: "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself."
Okay.
We'll see in verse 18 also in Leviticus.
That's very true. So here's a brother who has sinned, and you're trying to restore him with a spirit of gentleness, and there's kindness involved with that. But you're not allowing sin to just control their life, and well, it's okay. You're not doing that. Jesus spoke in Luke, if thy brother sin, you rebuke him. If he repents, what do? You forgive him. Wonder if I don't rebuke him. I bear sin in regard to my neighbor. And notice we pick up in verse 17. Thou shalt not hate thy brother in thy heart. Thou shalt surely rebuke thy neighbor and not bear sin because of him. I'm not saying we're going to bear his sin. His sin that you didn't rebuke goes on you. No. I will bear my sin because I did not rebuke the error. Well, you're not kind. Well, I'm godly. And I want to be right with God, and I care enough about your soul to talk about the fact that you're going the wrong way. I can be guilty of keeping my mouth shut when error is being practiced and taught. And we have to confront that. And people don't like that, but that's what we're supposed to do. And here's this principle we see here, in a moment of kindness, and don't hate your brother, as you sure do. I don't hate, but I can rebuke. And to do that with trying to win the soul, there's the gentleness that you're having, and the meekness and the long suffering that goes with teaching. But we can't overlook wrongs of others. And your greatest friend is the one that'll come to you with respect and bring out your error. That's the greatest friend you ever had. And you may not appreciate it, but that's saved your soul. Question number 6, what things could not be mixed with diverse kinds? Remember the Bible, they produced after their kind. We talk about the species, and like dogs and cats and cattle and mules and things of that after their kind. And so, what things cannot be mixed? Animals that are gendering. They gender two kinds of animals. Verse 19. You shall keep my statutes. Thou shalt not let thy cattle gender with a diverse kind. Thou shalt not sow a field with two kinds of seed. And neither shalt thou come upon thee a garment of two kinds, like maybe wool and linen. And two kinds, my Bible says, stuff mingled together. And there was some common sense about those things. We talked about the wool and the linen. One's very cool and one's hot. Sometimes when you're working as a priest would involve, they'd have their linens and they'd have their regular clothes of wool. But the idea of distinct kinds of animals, you don't bring them together. And we added this when we've studied Deuteronomy 23:23. You were not to yoke an ox with a donkey. That's not equal weight. That's not being yoked together. You're not of equal kind. And that would be a laborious thing for a donkey. And or an ox, they don't work together that way. And that's when Paul says, be not unequally yoked with unbelievers. You're a different kind. You don't belong together. Don't be out here going to their sacrifices and offering sacrifice unto their gods and then come to the table of the Lord and take the Lord's Supper. No, that's not going to work in the Lord's church. And they're going to have to come out of that. But he calls it be not unequally yoked. That's not being married to an unbeliever. It's being associated with one in the sense of their idolatry. And that's why he says you're to come out of them. So he told us to stay in marriages if the unbeliever didn't say come out of them. So it's not talking about marriage, but it's always used for that point. And we're yoked together as husband and wife. That makes a good picture and concept, makes a good sermon. But when we talk about in Corinthians, that context definitely dealing with something you've got to come out of. And that would be the idolatry. So they could be God's people. You're perfecting holiness in the fear of God. And that's how they were to do that. But there were idea of just common sense, keeping things together. They had their specific laws about that. Was fornication with a betrothed slave woman punishable by death? Surely he ought to be put to death, right? No, just offer a ram sacrifice and everything's okay. And the reason being, she was a slave. She had no say-so in the matter. She betrothed to a man, but she has no standing. And I think there's the point about that. But you read Deuteronomy 23:23, two people, a man and a woman, and she's betrothed to another man, and she has sex with another man, both of them will die. Both of them are to be killed. But nobody here is being killed because the component of being a slave and not having a free will in the matter. And it's this interesting point, but that's what we're seeing in verse 20. Whosoever lieth carnally with a woman that is a bondmaid, betrothed to a husband, and not at all redeemed, she's still a slave, nor freedom given her, they shall be punished. Some think, well, they went through a scourging, a beating. They may have done that. They shall not be put, they shall not be put to death because she was not free. And so there's God's wisdom on that issue. And he's, well, I don't think that's fair. Well, that's God. And the whole point was that it was not a freedom of will involved with this matter, that That is the difference, because they're both, I mean, both of them committing fornication, even though she's betrothed to somebody else. They're both going to die. They'll both be put to death. The fruit trees that the Israelites planted in Canaan was to be considered uncircumcised for how long? 3 years. 4th year, you're not to eat it. Who does it go to? God. 5th year, you can eat it. Now, planting fruit trees. So they're putting new trees into the ground when they come into the land. Where would they get them? You know, what nursery did they buy them from? Who was selling fruit trees at that time? You could bring them. They bring them to the land. Maybe they dig them up for where they were, but that was to take place. Now, all sorts of ideas about it. What do you do with fruit trees? You like the fruit when the first 2 or 3 years of a fruit tree, they don't produce very much. So what do? I pinch the flowers off of them. So what happens down the road? Oh, they produce a lot. And you see the indication that indeed you'll have abundant harvest, and some say, well, that's just using that kind of idea. But no, he calls it uncircumcised. We're dealing with a relationship to God. And it wasn't, well, you'll have more fruit if you pinch the flowers. And they're uncircumcised, but they'll be for 3 years. You were not to eat them. And it just so happens that newly planted fruit trees don't produce a lot in the first 3 years. But they were dedicated to God in the 4th year, and that's a part of it. All belongs to Him in the 4th year, because it's no longer, it's holy to God, and it's permissible, and something that would be all right for you to do. So that's verses 23 through 25. In the 4th year, verse 24, therefore they shall be holy, for giving praise unto Jehovah. In the 5th year you can eat of the fruit thereof, that it may yield unto you the increase thereof. Now you're able to partake of the increase, not necessarily because you pinched them for the first 3 years, you'll have a big crop. That's, that may happen, but the point is that relationship to God. He's laid down that law. There are probably some sound judgments behind that, because He's the creator of all things. But it's just interesting to me, they would bring trees and they would plant them in the new land. They always think, you're just going to live off the land that you have there. But they would be bringing things and planting. Have you planted new trees where you are? Well, Kathy's dad, he loved pecan trees, and he worked with them. And you go by their house today, we go there, those pecan trees are so gigantic, and he kind of made things where they have different varieties and all this sort of thing, but all of his work is still growing. And but he planted those trees from Stephenville. Question number 9. What was one not go to do for the dead? What was one not to do for the dead? As we look at question number 9. And you have to cut their bodies and have tattoos. First of all, we say in verse 26, you should not eat anything with blood. And this is connected with what a lot of the people that their land that come into. A lot of the things came from their influence in Egypt, Egyptian practices, and the pagans around them, idolaters around them. God's holy. These are things you'll be different than they are. You shall not eat anything with blood, neither shall you anyways use enchantments or practice augury. There's the idea of enchantments, like I can. There's a copperhead snake or a cobra, and I will speak. I'm a whisperer. I will enchantments, and will determine things reality by that. Or augury, where I will look. Some say to the clouds, but sometimes it might be the entrance of an animal, and I will predict the future. Or maybe look at your little hands and see the little lifelines, and we can tell you what. Tell your future. Well, in this context, we see in verse 28, ye shall not make cuttings in your flesh for the dead, nor print any marks upon you. I am Jehovah. This is in the context for the dead. Women would put flowers and print flowers, a lot of times with ink, upon their bodies. I mean, that's kind of what we think about with tattoos. But the idea of mourning for the dead, those were things that they did, and make cuttings in their flesh for the dead. We know at Mount Carmel, in order to appease the idols and the false gods, they cut themselves and bled and ran around and hollered. But this is for the dead. This is for the dead that have died, and how they would conduct themselves is going to be totally different. What would a father make his daughter a harlot? Now, I say why. That should be why. Why would a father do that to his daughter? He didn't tell you why. I'm just thinking, why would anybody do that? I'll make my daughter a prostitute. Why would you do that? Money. And opportunity. Because a lot of times there would be the priestesses, the prophetesses that would be daughters of idolatry, that would be connected with them. And they would bring that money. Deuteronomy 23:17 and 8, we see that the male homosexuals, sodomites, were called dogs. And here's the women, the girls are the harlots. Don't bring their wages into my sanctuary. That's money that we're not going to accept in God's sanctuary. Don't bring your money here. And it was a practice that was unholy. It would fill the land, as he says, with ungodliness. And just, well, I have my permission. My dad said I can make a living this way. And it was unholy then, it's unholy now. Describe one that has a familiar spirit today. We look at verse 31. Turn ye not unto them that have familiar spirits. What are they? Or unto the wizards. Have you ever played on a Ouija board? Have you ever? I'm not going. I'm going to bring up your great-great-great-grandfather. I think he wants to talk to you. And you're going to learn things that are happening in that world there, our idea of predictive future. That's familiar spirits. I'm going to talk to the dead. And we're going to determine with the dead what's going to happen in the future. And all sorts of ways. We've already talked about parts of that, of looking at omens and so forth, but talking a familiar spirit, call them up from the dead. The witch of Windsor, that's what happened in calling up people who have been dead before. And I think they were surprised when he came up, Samuel came up, but that was their practice. And today it hasn't changed any. We can have people that will consult with the dead for you and talk to you about that in order to give you an idea of what's going to happen in the future. That's part of the pagan world, and there we're to stay away from that. Why were God's people to treat the stranger and the sojourner as same as the homeborn? Because that's where we were once, right? You were there at one time. The stranger that sojourneth with you shall be unto you as a homeborn among you, and thou shalt love him as yourself, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. I am Jehovah your God. Because of your relationship with me, that's becomes what is important. What standards of judgment must be right? We talk about righteous standards. What about measures of length? What about weight measurements, a balance? What about the ephah of dry measurements? Almost a bushel, ephah is. And yet the hin is God, how many liters it is, but it was liquid form. So you have liquid form of measurements, the ephah, those will be the standards, the measures of length, the weight, the balances there. That had to be just. And that was something that they were to make sure that they followed. And ye shall observe all my statutes, in verse 7, all my ordinances, and do them. I am a Jehovah. So we have to close here, but all of a sudden, you're going to read in chapter 20 some of the things we've just studied. And we didn't get a chance to get there, but you tell me why that's not redundant, just to be redundant. What difference do you see in chapter 20 when he speaks about the same things from chapter 19? And that will be what we'll look at. And you got 2 weeks, I guess, to do that one. So next time will be after our singing vacation Bible school. Okay, thank you.